Maria Muñoz stood at the kitchen counter, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her phone. The message had appeared out of nowhere. "Watch your back." Her heart pounded, a mix of fear and confusion. Who would send this? And why? Her gaze flickered to the family room where her two children were playing, their laughter filling the air, a sharp contrast to the growing unease inside her. Joel Pellot walked in, his footsteps deliberate. As always, his presence filled the room with a quiet authority that Maria had grown to dread. "You've been on your phone a lot lately," he remarked, his tone casual yet laced with an edge that made Maria stiffen. She quickly locked the screen and forced a smile. "Just checking emails." Joel didn't press further, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Maria's chest tightened. She knew that look too well. A mixture of suspicion and control masked as concern. It was a look that had grown more frequent in recent months. Later that evening, Maria sat at the dining table, her journal open before her. The pen hovered over the page, her thoughts jumbled and racing. How had it come to this? The man she once loved now felt like a stranger she could no longer trust. Her mind wandered to the arguments, the financial discrepancies she had uncovered in their joint account, and Joel's increasingly unpredictable moods. Divorce felt like her only escape, but the mere thought of confronting Joel about it made her stomach churn. She wrote, "I can't stay like this, but leaving feels impossible. He'll never let me go." The words stared back at her, heavy with the weight of her reality. Joel's voice broke her concentration. "What are you writing?" he asked, his figure looming in the doorway. Maria closed the journal with a swift motion, her heart racing. "Just some notes for work," she lied, her voice steady despite the panic rising inside her. Joel nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. As the night deepened, Maria lay awake in bed. Joel's steady breathing beside her was a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. Her phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. She hesitated before picking it up. Another message appeared. "If you don't act soon, it'll be too late." Her breath caught. The cryptic warning added to the sense of dread that had been building for weeks. She felt trapped, cornered in her own life, with no one to turn to except the faint hope of escape. The following morning, Maria dropped the kids off at school, her mind racing with plans. She pulled into a parking lot a block away from her lawyer's office. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Could she really go through with this? The thought of Joel's reaction sent shivers down her spine, but the fear of staying outweighed the risks of leaving. Maria took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, clutching her purse tightly. The door to the lawyer's office loomed ahead, a symbol of both hope and terror. As she walked toward it, her phone buzzed again, the same number, the same message. "You can't run forever." The house was unnervingly quiet when Joel Pellot picked up his phone to dial 911. His voice, calm yet deliberate, cut through the stillness. "My wife," he said. "She's unconscious. I think she overdosed." The operator's instructions were met with measured responses, his tone betraying neither panic nor urgency. Joel's detachment was unsettling, a stark contrast to the scene in the bedroom. Maria Muñoz lay motionless on the bed, her features pale against the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Her arm was outstretched, punctuated with faint needle marks. Syringes and IV supplies littered the nightstand, their presence incongruous in a home like theirs. Joel paced methodically, checking her pulse before standing by the doorway, as if waiting for the inevitable. The sirens pierced the silence, and the paramedics arrived in a rush. Joel met them at the door, gesturing towards the bedroom without saying much. As the EMTs worked, their faces betrayed confusion. "What are all these medical supplies doing here?" one of them murmured. Joel, overhearing, interjected curtly. "She was self-medicating, anxiety, insomnia. She wasn't in her right mind." In the living room, a neighbor peeked through the window, her face illuminated by the flashing lights. Joel caught sight of her and muttered under his breath, "No one will believe her now." It was faint, almost inaudible, but enough to send a chill down the spine of the EMT standing nearby. She glanced at him sharply as though trying to gauge the meaning behind his words. Maria was pronounced dead shortly after. The EMTs exchanged uneasy glances as they prepared to transport her body. One of them, unable to suppress his discomfort, asked Joel if he knew why Maria would have such specialized medical equipment. Joel's reply was measured, almost rehearsed. "She worked in a clinic before we moved here. She kept some supplies. I didn't ask questions." Detective Ryan Carter arrived just as Maria's body was being moved. The sight of the equipment and the precision of the setup immediately caught his attention. He turned to Joel, who was seated on the couch, his expression blank. "Mr. Pellot," Carter began, "I need to ask you a few questions." Before Joel could answer, his phone rang. The sound cut through the tension like a blade. He glanced at the screen, his face momentarily losing its composure. He stepped away to take the call, but Carter followed closely, catching fragments of the conversation. A voice on the other end, sharp and accusing, said, "I know what you did." Joel's face darkened as he whispered, "Now is not the time." The call ended abruptly, leaving Joel visibly shaken. Carter's curiosity deepened. "Who was that?" he asked, his tone sharp. Joel hesitated, then forced a calm response. "A family member. They're upset about Maria." Carter didn't press further, but made a mental note. The pieces of the puzzle weren't adding up, and Joel's demeanor only raised more questions. As Carter examined the room, he noticed a faint trace of something unusual, a smudge on one of the syringes that seemed out of place. It was the first of many breadcrumbs that would lead to unraveling the truth. As the night stretched on, Joel sat alone in the living room staring at his phone. His hand hovered over a number in his call log, labeled only as unknown. The screen dimmed, and he leaned back, his face shadowed by the dim light. Outside, the world moved on, oblivious to the storm brewing within the walls of the Pellot home. The autopsy results arrived in a sealed envelope, placed solemnly on Detective Ryan Carter's desk. The details inside promised to be pivotal, yet Carter hesitated before opening it. This was no ordinary case. The elements at play seemed orchestrated, calculated. When he finally unfolded the report, it revealed something far more chilling than he had anticipated. Maria Muñoz's death had not been caused by clonazepam, as her husband Joel Pellot had claimed. Instead, her body contained a mixture of powerful surgical drugs: morphine, Demerol, Versed, propofol, ketamine, lidocaine, and Narcan. These substances, used individually, were dangerous without medical supervision. Together, they were a recipe for certain death. Carter leaned back, letting out a slow breath. Joel's access to such drugs as a nurse anesthetist made him the primary suspect, but something felt incomplete. A single set of hands couldn't weave a web this complex. The coroner had flagged another anomaly, a smudged fingerprint on one of the syringes found at the scene. It wasn't Joel's, nor Maria's. A third party? Carter's mind raced, assembling pieces of a puzzle that didn't yet make sense. Later that day, Carter visited the forensic lab where he spoke with Dr. Emily Martinez. "The mix of drugs is deliberate," she explained, her voice tinged with unease. "It's not something a layperson could guess. This was planned, executed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." "Someone like Joel Pellot," Carter replied, his jaw tightening. "Yes," Martinez agreed, "but—" She hesitated before adding, "It doesn't feel complete. This mix of substances, it's almost too methodical, like someone wanted to leave breadcrumbs." Breadcrumbs. The word stayed with Carter as he returned to his office. Among the items recovered from Maria's belongings was a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with neatly penned entries, part diary, part confessional. As he flipped through, one sentence stopped him cold. "He'll never let me go alive." Carter read the line again, then scanned the surrounding entries. Maria had written extensively about her deteriorating marriage, her fears, and her plans to leave Joel. The despair was palpable, but so was her resolve. A few pages later, another ominous note caught his eye. "I've seen the darkness in his eyes. If something happens to me, don't believe his lies." As Carter closed the journal, a folded slip of paper fell out. It was a handwritten note, shorter and more cryptic than the entries in the journal. It read, "Trust no one." That night, Carter sat alone in his car outside the Muñoz Pellot home, staring at the dimly lit windows. His instincts told him there was more to the story, more than just a controlling husband and a tragic death. The smudged fingerprint and the cryptic messages hinted at layers yet to be uncovered. For the first time in years, Carter felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Emily Martinez. Her voice was sharp, urgent. "Detective, we just found traces of propofol on Maria's clothing. More than would make sense even in a medical setting." "What are you saying?" Carter asked, gripping the steering wheel. "I'm saying this wasn't just an overdose, Detective. This was a staged execution." Detective Ryan Carter sat across from Vanessa Lopez in the small, dimly lit interview room. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. "Maria was terrified of him," Vanessa said, her voice trembling. She didn't think Joel would ever let her leave. She glanced at her hands, tightly clasped, as if holding herself together. Carter studied her carefully. Vanessa wasn't just a friend. She had been Maria's confidant, the one Maria turned to when the walls of her marriage began closing in. "What did she tell you?" Carter asked, leaning forward slightly, his tone steady but probing. Vanessa exhaled shakily. Everything. The arguments, the way he controlled every part of her life. Her money, her time, even what she wore. She was planning to leave him. She gave me an envelope a few weeks ago and said, "If something happens to me, give this to the police." Vanessa reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed manila envelope, placing it on the table between them. I didn't think I'd ever have to use it." Carter slid the envelope toward him, his curiosity piqued. "What's in it?" he asked. "I don't know. Maria told me not to open it unless—" Vanessa trailed off, her voice breaking. "Unless something happened to her." Opening the envelope with deliberate care, Carter found legal documents, a draft of divorce papers, and a USB drive. Vanessa watched nervously as Carter pocketed the items. "Did Joel know about these?" Carter asked. Vanessa hesitated before nodding. He suspected. Maria said he'd been digging through her things. The room grew tense. Vanessa's gaze darted to the door as if expecting Joel to burst in at any moment. "I've been getting these texts," she added, her voice dropping. "Threats. They started after Maria died." "Threats?" Carter's brow furrowed. "From who?" Vanessa shook her head. "I don't know. They're from an unknown number. They keep saying I should stay out of it, or I'll end up like Maria." Her voice cracked as tears filled her eyes. Before Carter could respond, his phone buzzed. It was Emily Martinez. "You need to see what's on that USB drive," she said urgently. "I think it'll explain a lot." Later that evening, Carter plugged the USB drive into his laptop. The first file was a video, recorded by Maria. Her face filled the screen, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "If you're watching this," Maria began, her voice trembling, "then something has happened to me." She recounted months of escalating tension, revealing Joel's controlling behavior and his obsession with maintaining the image of a perfect family. Then her tone shifted, her eyes narrowing. "He's hiding things," she said. "There are secrets he doesn't want anyone to know." The video cut to a series of images, stacks of documents, photos of medical vials, and a text exchange between Joel and an unidentified number. The messages were chilling. "I need it done quickly. No loose ends." As Carter absorbed the information, a sharp noise broke his concentration. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Vanessa, a single word: "Help." Carter bolted upright, his heart racing. Vanessa's car had been found vandalized earlier that evening, but now her safety felt more precarious than ever. Grabbing his coat, he headed out, the USB drive still clutched in his hand. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, but with every answer came more questions and an ever-deepening sense of urgency. Detective Ryan Carter watched as Joel Pellot entered the precinct interview room, his demeanor composed yet unnervingly detached. Joel's lawyer, Andrew Collins, followed close behind, offering the kind of polite nod that screamed distrust. Carter set the stage carefully. This wasn't about rattling Joel, but letting his lies unravel under their own weight. "Mr. Pellot," Carter began, his tone neutral, "thank you for coming in. I know this must be a difficult time." He flipped open his notebook, his pen poised. "Let's start with the night of your wife's passing. You said Maria was struggling with mental health?" Joel leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Yes, she'd been distant for months, depressed, anxious. I tried to help, but she wouldn't let me in." Carter nodded, his eyes scanning Joel's body language. "And the syringes and medical supplies found in your home, can you explain those?" Joel's jaw tightened. "Maria worked in a clinic before. She kept things around. I didn't think much of it." "Interesting," Carter said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were photographs of a hidden storage locker rented under an alias Joel had used. The images depicted vials of surgical drugs, syringes, and, a chilling addition, Maria's missing wedding ring. Joel's composure faltered briefly, but he recovered quickly. "I don't know what that is," he said flatly. Carter leaned in. "We found your fingerprints on a vial of propofol in that locker, Joel. Are you sure you don't know what it is?" Joel's lawyer interjected. "Detective, unless you have more substantial evidence, we're done here." Carter smirked slightly, pulling out another piece of evidence. Financial records showing a significant purchase of surgical drugs tied back to Joel. The tension in the room thickened as Carter placed them on the table. These records suggest otherwise. Joel's face darkened, but he said nothing. His silence was deafening. As the meeting concluded, Carter returned to his desk, his mind racing. He reviewed the evidence again. The locker, the drugs, the ring. It all pointed to Joel. Yet something felt incomplete. The precision, the execution. It hinted at a larger scheme, perhaps involving an accomplice. Later that evening, Carter received a call from Dr. Emily Martinez. "Detective, we analyzed the propofol vial from the locker," she said. "We found a second set of prints." "Do they match Maria?" Carter asked. "No," Martinez replied, her voice grave. "They don't match Joel either." The revelation sent a jolt through Carter. If not Maria or Joel, then who? The possibility of a third party turned the case on its head. Someone else was involved. Someone who had stayed hidden in the shadows, orchestrating this web of lies. As Carter pondered this new lead, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "You're looking in the wrong places. Back off before it's too late." Detective Ryan Carter sat in his car, replaying the video Vanessa had forwarded. The footage was jarring. It showed Joel Pellot in their bedroom, hovering over an unconscious Maria. His actions were deliberate, methodical, but something was off. The video was clearly edited, with abrupt cuts and distorted audio. A shadowy figure entered the frame briefly, but their face was obscured. This was no ordinary case. Carter was now chasing a conspiracy. Determined to uncover the truth, Carter followed the lead from the anonymous call to a former colleague of Joel's, Dr. Alan Pierce. Meeting Pierce at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, Carter wasted no time. "Tell me about Joel Pellot," he demanded. Pierce shifted uncomfortably. "Joel? He was brilliant but reckless. Always thought he was smarter than everyone else." Pierce revealed a troubling history. Joel had been reprimanded at his previous job for stealing medical supplies, vials of powerful anesthetics and sedatives, but managed to avoid severe consequences due to his skill and connections. "He knew how to cover his tracks," Pierce admitted, "but people started noticing." Carter leaned forward. "Did he ever talk about Maria?" Pierce hesitated before nodding. "Not directly, but he once mentioned how important it was to maintain control. At the time, I thought he meant his work. Now, I'm not so sure." The conversation left Carter with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Joel's obsession with control extended far beyond his professional life. Later that day, Carter met with Maria's lawyer, Stephanie Grant, who had been helping her prepare for a divorce. Stephanie handed Carter a file Maria had entrusted to her, one that hinted at Joel's illicit activities. "Maria was scared," Stephanie said, her voice somber. "She believed Joel was involved in something far bigger than just their marriage." The file contained financial documents showing suspicious transactions, large withdrawals and deposits tied to an account in Joel's name. One particularly damning receipt showed a purchase of untraceable medical equipment. Carter's stomach tightened. Joel wasn't just stealing, he was operating on a level far more sinister. That evening, Carter received another anonymous message. This time, it wasn't a text, but an email, accompanied by a video attachment. The subject line read, "You're closer than you think." The video was another fragment of the night Maria died. It showed Joel arguing with the shadowy figure. The audio was garbled, but one phrase was clear: "If she talks, we're both finished." Carter's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about Joel anymore. Someone else had as much to lose. As Carter pieced together the puzzle, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Emily Martinez from Forensics. "Detective, I found something you need to see," she said, urgency in her voice. "The syringe from Joel's locker. It had a chemical marker linking it to a distributor known for supplying black market drugs." Carter gripped the phone tighter. "Do we know who?" Emily hesitated. "Not yet, but the trail leads to someone high up. This isn't small time." The web of lies surrounding Maria's death was growing larger by the second. Carter felt the pressure mounting. Maria's voice, captured in her journal, echoed in his mind. "Don't trust anyone." Detective Ryan Carter stared at the grainy footage from the hidden camera, his mind racing as he paused the video on the shadowy figure standing over Maria Muñoz's unconscious body. Joel Pellot's face was unmistakable, his hands moving deftly as he prepared a syringe, but it was the figure in the corner, partially obscured, their movements hesitant yet complicit, that deepened the mystery. "Who are you?" Carter muttered under his breath. The accomplice's face was only partially visible, but the outline hinted at someone familiar. someone who had purposefully stayed in the background until now. Carter's phone buzzed. Emily Martinez's voice came through, tinged with urgency. "Detective, I ran the chemical analysis on the syringe. It matches the drugs tied to that rogue distributor we flagged earlier." "Which means?" Carter asked, his grip on the phone tightening. "It means Joel wasn't working alone. This is part of something bigger, and whoever helped him knew exactly what they were doing." Later that day, Carter arranged for Vanessa Lopez to review the footage. As Maria's closest confidant, Vanessa might recognize the mysterious accomplice. Sitting in the dimly lit room, Vanessa's hands shook as she watched the video. "That person," she began, her voice trembling. "I've seen them before, at Joel's clinic." Carter's gaze sharpened. "Are you sure?" Vanessa nodded. "I remember Maria mentioning him, one of Joel's colleagues. She said he gave her a strange feeling, like he was always watching her." The lead was invaluable. Carter cross-referenced staff records from Joel's former workplace and found a name that stood out: Dr. Gregory Langston, a pharmacist with a history of disciplinary actions. His file was riddled with red flags: unauthorized access to controlled substances, discrepancies in inventory logs, but no formal charges. Armed with this information, Carter confronted Joel during another interrogation. This time, Joel's composure cracked. "Langston had nothing to do with this," he spat, his tone defensive. "Leave him out of it." Carter leaned in, his voice calm but cutting. "Funny, I didn't mention his name." Joel's eyes darted away, his jaw tightening. It was all the confirmation Carter needed. As Carter built his case against Langston, a new piece of evidence surfaced. Maria's journal, which had already provided critical insights, contained a chilling entry. "There's someone else. Joel calls him the cleaner. If anything happens to me, he's part of it." That night, Carter received an anonymous tip, an email with an attached audio file. The recording captured a heated argument between Joel and Langston, their voices low but unmistakably tense. "You're supposed to handle this cleanly," Joel hissed. "If this blows up, we're both finished." Langston's response was colder, almost clinical. "You worry too much. No one will find out." The email's sender was untraceable, but the contents were damning. Langston wasn't just an accomplice. He was a critical piece of Joel's plan to silence Maria permanently. As Carter prepared to issue a warrant for Langston's arrest, his phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message, this one containing just 3 words: "You're being watched." The air inside the precinct was tense as Detective Ryan Carter walked into the interrogation room, files in hand. Joel Pellot sat at the table, his posture stiff but confident, his lawyer Andrew Collins seated beside him. Carter placed the files on the table deliberately, letting the weight of the moment settle in the room. "We've come across new evidence, Joel," Carter began, his tone even. "Evidence that paints a clearer picture of what happened the night Maria died." Joel's expression remained stoic, but there was a flicker of tension in his jaw. "I've already told you everything I know. Maria was struggling. She did this to herself." Carter leaned forward, locking eyes with Joel. "Did she, though? Because this video tells a different story." He slid a laptop across the table and hit play. The footage taken from the hidden camera showed Joel preparing a syringe, his actions precise. Moments later, the shadowy figure stepped into the frame, their face partially obscured. Andrew Collins immediately objected. "Detective, this video is circumstantial. It proves nothing." Carter ignored him, directing his words to Joel. "Who is this with you? And why are you injecting Maria with something she didn't consent to?" Joel's composure began to crack, beads of sweat forming on his temple. Before he could respond, Collins intervened. "My client has nothing further to say." The tension was broken by a knock on the door. Officer Ramirez entered, handing Carter a note. It was from Vanessa Lopez, requesting to speak urgently. Carter nodded, excusing himself and leaving Joel and his lawyer behind. In another room, Vanessa sat nervously, clutching a folder. "Detective, I found this in Maria's things," she said, handing it over. Inside were copies of emails between Joel and Dr. Gregory Langston, detailing transactions for untraceable medical supplies. The tone of the emails was cold, transactional. One line stood out: "Ensure it's irreversible. She can't talk after this." "This is enough to arrest Langston," Carter muttered, more to himself than Vanessa, but her eyes widened. "There's more," she whispered, pulling out a letter sealed in an envelope. It was addressed to Maria, but Vanessa had never opened it until now. The letter was brief but damning. "Maria, if you're reading this, it means Joel's plan has failed, but be careful. You don't know who you're dealing with." Carter's phone buzzed, breaking the moment. It was Emily Martinez from the lab. Detective, we've confirmed Langston's prints on the syringe. We've also traced the drugs to a batch stolen from a hospital 2 months ago. Carter's chest tightened. The pieces were falling into place, but the stakes were escalating. If Langston was involved, how far did the conspiracy reach? And who else was pulling the strings? Before he could process it fully, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "You're getting too close. Back off." The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Joel Pellot entered, flanked by his defense lawyer Andrew Collins. His face betrayed no emotion, but Detective Ryan Carter knew better. Joel thrived on control, and this trial was the first time he couldn't manipulate the narrative. The prosecution opened with a fiery statement. David Morales, the lead prosecutor, outlined Joel's calculated moves, the drugs, the hidden storage locker, and Maria's missing wedding ring. "This was not a tragic accident," Morales declared, his voice cutting through the courtroom. "This was premeditated murder by a man determined to silence his wife forever." Joel's lawyer countered with an audacious strategy, framing Maria as a woman on the edge, desperate and unstable. Maria struggled with depression, Collins argued. "The evidence you'll see today will raise doubts about her state of mind and whether Joel truly bears the blame." The first day of testimony was grueling. Vanessa Lopez took the stand, her voice quivering as she recounted Maria's fear of Joel. "She told me he was controlling, that she couldn't breathe around him," Vanessa said. "She wanted to leave, but she was scared of what he might do." Collins pounced during cross-examination, painting Vanessa as a meddling outsider. "Isn't it true," he pressed, "that you encouraged Maria to leave her husband? That you interfered in their marriage?" Vanessa's response was firm. "I encouraged her to save herself." The tension escalated when Carter took the stand. His testimony was methodical, walking the jury through the evidence. He presented the USB drive with Maria's recording, the autopsy report, and the damning emails between Joel and Dr. Gregory Langston. "Joel had access to the drugs," Carter stated. "He had the knowledge, and he had the motive." But the defense wasn't done. Collins introduced a new angle, a supposed secret lover of Maria's. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, holding up a photograph of an unidentified man, "there's more to this story than meets the eye." Morales quickly rebutted, pointing out the lack of concrete evidence linking Maria to the man. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted. Then came the surprise witness. Carter had no idea what to expect when Langston entered the courtroom. The pharmacist looked gaunt, his hands trembling as he adjusted the microphone. Under questioning, Langston admitted to supplying Joel with the drugs, but claimed he was coerced. "He threatened me," Langston said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He said if I didn't help, he'd ruin my life." Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Langston described their arrangement, revealing Joel's meticulous planning and growing desperation as Maria prepared to leave him. Morales seized the moment, driving home the point that Joel's actions were not those of a grieving husband, but of a man desperate to cover his tracks. As the day ended, Joel's mask of composure began to slip. He whispered something to Collins, who immediately requested a recess. Carter watched as Joel was led out, his expression cold but his eyes filled with something new, fear. That night, Carter returned to his office, exhausted but resolute. The trial had revealed cracks in Joel's armor, but the fight wasn't over. The truth was unraveling, but with every answer came another question. Detective Ryan Carter sat in his office, staring at the transcript of Dr. Gregory Langston's testimony. The man had crumbled under pressure in court, admitting that Joel Pellot had coerced him into supplying the deadly cocktail of drugs used on Maria Muñoz. Yet something still gnawed at Carter. Langston's confession felt rehearsed, as if he were hiding something, or someone. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Officer Ramirez entered, holding a stack of papers. "Lab results just came in," she said, placing them on Carter's desk. "The syringe traces matched the drugs stolen from Memorial Hospital 2 months ago." Carter scanned the report, his brow furrowing. The theft had been well documented, but no suspects were ever identified. He flipped through the pages, landing on a single, overlooked detail. The security cameras in the hospital storage area had been disabled for precisely 15 minutes, the exact time of the theft. "Who had access to the cameras?" Carter asked, already dialing a number. "Hospital IT says only one person had the clearance, Joel Pellot," Ramirez replied grimly. Carter leaned back in his chair. Joel's reach had extended further than he'd anticipated, but the evidence was building. As Carter prepared to leave, his phone buzzed with a message from Emily Martinez. You need to see this. At the lab, Emily placed a small vial on the counter. This was found in Langston's car after his testimony, she explained. The contents match the drugs used on Maria, but here's the twist. Langston's fingerprints aren't the only ones on it. Carter raised an eyebrow. Whose are they? Emily hesitated before answering. A partial match to a name in the federal database, someone connected to an organized drug ring operating in Texas. The revelation was staggering. Joel's actions weren't just those of a desperate husband, they were tied to a larger criminal network. Carter's mind raced as he pieced together the implications. Maria's death wasn't just a tragic end to a toxic marriage. It was collateral damage in a much bigger operation. Carter decided it was time to confront Langston directly. Meeting him in a secured holding room, Carter didn't waste time. "Who else is involved?" he demanded, his voice cold and precise. Langston avoided eye contact, his hands trembling. "You don't understand," he muttered. "If I talk, they'll kill me." "You're already a dead man if you don't," Carter shot back. "Joel isn't your only problem now." Langston's shoulders sagged, and for a moment Carter thought he'd broken through. But then Langston leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. Joel, he made it messy." "Messy how?" Carter pressed, but before Langston could answer, the door burst open. An officer rushed in, her face pale. "Detective Langston's lawyer is here. He's refusing to let him talk any further." As Langston was escorted out, he turned to Carter, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and regret. "Watch your back," he warned. "You're in deeper than you know." That night, as Carter reviewed the day's developments, his phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "Stop now, last warning." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the closer Carter got, the more dangerous the game became. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. Joel Pellot sat at the defense table, his posture rigid, his hands clasped tightly together. Despite his outward composure, there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Detective Ryan Carter sat in the gallery, his gaze unwavering, watching the culmination of months of relentless work. The judge addressed the jury foreman. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood, clearing his throat. "We have, Your Honor." He unfolded a piece of paper and began to read. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Joel Pellot, guilty." Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Joel's face hardened, his jaw tightening. Behind him, Maria Muñoz's family erupted into quiet sobs, their relief palpable after years of grief and unanswered questions. Vanessa Lopez, seated beside them, gripped Maria's father's hand, her own tears falling silently. Joel's lawyer, Andrew Collins, immediately requested the court's attention. "Your Honor, we intend to appeal this decision. There were numerous procedural irregularities." The judge raised a hand to silence him. "Mr. Collins, this is neither the time nor place. The verdict stands." Prosecutor David Morales stood, his tone steady and deliberate as he addressed the court. "The people of this state sought justice for Maria Muñoz, and today we achieved it. Let this serve as a reminder. No one is above the law." Joel's sentencing followed swiftly. The judge's voice was stern, final. "Joel Pellot, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." As the words settled over the room, Joel finally spoke, his voice low but laced with venom. "You think this is over? You have no idea what's coming." His cryptic statement sent a chill through the courtroom. Carter leaned forward, his instincts flaring. Joel wasn't bluffing. There was more to uncover. After the proceedings, Maria's father approached Carter. His weathered face was a mixture of gratitude and lingering sorrow. "Thank you, Detective," he said, his voice breaking. "You gave Maria a voice when she couldn't speak for herself." Carter nodded solemnly. "She deserved justice. And this is just the beginning." Later that night, Carter sat in his office, staring at the case files. The victory in court felt hollow. The evidence had painted a damning picture of Joel's actions, but the shadowy accomplices and connections to a broader criminal network remained elusive. As he sifted through the documents, his phone buzzed. Another anonymous message. "Congratulations, Detective, but you've only scratched the surface." Carter exhaled slowly, his resolve hardening. Maria's story had been heard, but the fight wasn't over. The conspiracy Joel was part of stretched far beyond her tragic death, and Carter knew he wouldn't rest until every last thread was unraveled. The memorial for Maria Muñoz was held on a breezy autumn afternoon, the kind of day she would have loved. Friends, family, and community members gathered in the small park near her home. their faces a mix of sorrow and quiet resolve. Maria's father stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. She was more than a daughter, a mother, a friend, he began, his voice steady despite the emotion etched into every word. Maria was a light in this world, extinguished far too soon. Today we honor her not as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective grief palpable. Vanessa Lopez, seated in the front row, clutched a folder containing Maria's journal entries. These words, once private, had now become a beacon of hope for others trapped in similar circumstances. Detective Ryan Carter stood off to the side, observing quietly. He had avoided the spotlight throughout the trial, content to let the evidence speak for itself. But as Maria's father continued, Carter's gaze drifted to a small envelope in his jacket pocket, the anonymous package he had received the night before. Inside the envelope was a single USB drive. Carter hadn't yet watched the contents, knowing instinctively it held answers he wasn't ready to confront. The sender's cryptic note, "The real story begins now," lingered in his thoughts, casting a shadow over the day's somber triumph. As the ceremony concluded, Vanessa approached Carter, her eyes red from crying. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing her, for not giving up." Carter nodded, his voice soft. Maria deserved justice, but this isn't over. Later that evening, Carter sat at his desk, staring at the USB drive. Finally, he inserted it into his computer. The screen lit up with a series of files, documents, emails, and a single video labeled "Final Warning." He clicked it, and Joel Pellot's face appeared, his expression smug despite the prison setting. "You've done well, Detective," Joel said, his voice calm, almost mocking. "But you're only scratching the surface. You think this ends with me? You're wrong. There are bigger players in this game, and they won't be as forgiving." The video ended abruptly, leaving Carter with more questions than answers. The documents provided names, figures tied to an organized drug ring operating across state lines. Carter's pulse quickened. Joel hadn't been lying. Maria's death was only a fragment of a much larger conspiracy. The next morning, Maria's journal entries were published in a national newspaper, sparking a wave of awareness about domestic abuse and toxic relationships. Vanessa, inspired by Maria's courage, launched a foundation in her name, dedicating herself to helping others escape the kind of nightmare Maria endured. As Carter drove to the station, the envelope's contents replayed in his mind. He knew the fight was far from over. Maria's story had ignited something powerful, a refusal to let the truth be buried, and Carter, with his unyielding resolve, was determined to see it through to the end. What do you think of Joel Pellot and the tangled web of lies surrounding Maria Muñoz's tragic story? Were justice and truth truly served, or is there more yet to uncover? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another gripping tale. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories that delve into the mysteries and truths that shape our world.